Greyhawk from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. This article is about the role-playing game setting. For other uses, see Greyhawk, disambiguation. Greyhawk, also known as the world of Greyhawk, is a fictional world designed as a campaign setting for the Dungeons & Dragons fantasy role-playing game. Although not the first campaign world developed for Dungeons & Dragons, Dave Arneson's Blackmore campaign predated it by about a year. The world of Greyhawk closely identified with early development of the game, beginning in 1972, and after being published, it remained associated with Dungeons & Dragons publications until 2008. The world itself started as a simple dungeon under a castle designed by Gary Gygax for the amusement of his children and friends, but it was rapidly expanded to include not only a complex multi-layered dungeon environment, but also the nearby city of Greyhawk, and eventually an entire world. In addition to the campaign world, which was published in several editions over 20 years, Greyhawk was also used as the setting for many adventures published in support of the game, as well as for RPGA's massively shared Living Greyhawk campaign from 2000 to 2008. Setting. The world of Greyhawk is located on a planet called Earth. Earth has an axial tilt of 30 degrees, which causes greater seasonal temperature variation than on Earth, and is controlled by wizardly and divine magic that shifts weather patterns to be more favorable to the populace. Castle Greyhawk was the most famous dungeon in Oath, that's how you say it, Oath, the home campaign world of Gary Gygax. Players in the earliest days of this campaign mostly stayed within Castle Greyhawk's dungeons, but Gygax envisioned the rest of his world as a sort of parallel Earth, and the original Oath, pronounced Oath, that's how you say it, as with a Brooklyn accent, Oath, looked much like the real world Earth, but filled with imaginary cities and countries. Several years later, when TSR produced the original World of Greyhawk folio, 1980, Gygax was asked to produce a map of the world and decided to create something new which still featured many of the locales from his original world of Oath, but with new geography. Gygax also connected Dave Arneson's Blackmore to his world by including a country by that name in Oath. In his later novel, Dance of Demons, 1988, Gygax destroyed Greyhawk's Oath and replaced it with a new fantasy world of Yarth. The Flanaess is the eastern part of the continent of Auric, one of the 4 continents of Oath, acting as the setting of dozens of adventures published between the 1970s and 2000s. In late 1972, Dave Arneson demonstrated a new type of game to a group of gamers in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, including game designer Gygax. Gygax agreed to develop a set of rules with Arneson and get the game published. The game eventually became known as Dungeons & Dragons. Gygax designed a set of dungeons underneath the ruins of Castle Greyhawk as a testing ground for new rules, character classes, and spells. In those early days, there was no Flanaess. The world map of Oath was developed by Gygax as circumstances dictated, the new cities and lands simply drawn over a map of North America. Gygax and Kuntz further developed this campaign setting, and by 1976, the lands within a radius of 50 miles had been mapped in depth, and the lands within a radius of approximately 500 miles were in outline form. Following yet more work in 1978, Gygax agreed to publish his world and decided to redevelop Oath from scratch. Once he had sketched out the entire planet to his satisfaction, one hemisphere of Oath was dominated by a massive continent called Auric. Gygax decided to concentrate his first efforts on the continent of Auric and asked TSR's printing house about the maximum size of paper they could handle. The answer was 34 by 22 inches, 86 centimeters by 56 centimeters. I got lost. Oh, there we go. He found that using the scale he desired, he could fit only the northeast corner of Auric on 2 of the sheets. This corner of Auric became known as the Flanaess, so named in Gygax's mind because of the peaceful people known as the Flanae, who had once lived there. Gygax also added many more new regions, countries, and cities, bringing the number of political states to 60. Needing original place names for all of the geographical and political places on his map, Gygax sometimes resorted to wordplay based on the names of friends and acquaintances. For instance, Perrinland was named after Jeff Perrin, who co-wrote the rules for chainmail with Gygax. Ernst was a homophone of Ernst, his son Ernie, and Sunday was a near homophone of Cindy, another of Gygax's children. From Gygax's prototype map, Darlene Piccoul, a freelance artist in Lake Geneva, developed a full-color map on a hex grid. Gygax was so pleased with the end result that he quickly switched his home Greyhawk campaign over to the new world he had created. Ultimately, the original Castle Greyhawk was never published for public play, instead with many of the elements of Gygax's original campaign becoming the seed for other adventures. Development history. Early development. In the late 1960s, Gary Gygax, a military history buff and pulp fantasy fan, was a central founding figure in the Castle and Crusade Society. The C&C Society, as it was known, served enthusiasts of miniature wargaming in the Middle Ages and published an occasional newsletter known as the Domesday Book. Following up on a promise he made in Domesday Book number 5, Gygax presented the Great Kingdom Map, circa June 1971, in Domesday number 9, to be used as a game setting for the Society. Members thereafter began claiming territories, including member Dave Arneson, who was an officer of the organization and frequent contributor to the newsletter. Arneson claimed a territory he named Blackmore, a setting he had already begun developing in his home campaign, and Gygax reserved for himself a territory on Lake Near Div. In addition to historically based medieval wargaming, both Gygax and Arneson were enthusiasts of adding fantasy elements to their games. To this end, Gygax created a fantasy supplement for the Chainmail rule set for medieval miniatures that he was co-writing with Jeff Perrin. Released in the late spring of 1971, this booklet included rules for fantasy monsters, wizards, and magical weapons. Around the same time in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Dave Arneson, impressed by the Brownstein role-playing games of fellow wargamer David Weasley, developed the Barony of Blackmore as a setting for Brownstein-style games. Arneson based his game around the village, castle, and dungeons of Blackmore. The castle itself was represented on the table by an actual plastic kit model of a medieval castle. Arneson informed the players that instead of controlling regiments, they would each take one individual character into the castle of the Barony of Blackmore to explore its dangerous dungeons. Arneson drew from numerous sources, but quickly incorporated the fantasy supplement of Chainmail into his games. After about a year and a half of play, Arneson, Blackmore, and fellow gamer David McGarry Dungeon Board Game traveled to Lake Geneva in November or December 1972 to pitch their respective games to Gygax, who at that time was a representative of the Guidon Games Company. Gygax was immediately intrigued by the concept of individual characters exploring a dungeon setting. He and Arneson agreed to co-develop a set of rules, and Gygax quickly developed a castle and dungeon of his own, Castle Greyhawk. Set within his portion of the Great Kingdom map. Castle Greyhawk is sometimes considered the first dungeon in Dungeons & Dragons, and pioneered the roots of the mega dungeon format of gaming. Two of his children, Ernie and Elise, were the first players, and during their first session as Tensor and Alisa, they fought and destroyed the first monsters of the Greyhawk dungeon. Gygax recalled them as being either giant centipedes or a nest of scorpions. During the same session, Ernie and Elise also found the first treasure, a chest of 3,000 copper coins, which was too heavy to carry, much to the children's chagrin. After his children had gone to bed, Gygax immediately began working on a second level for the dungeon. At the next play session, Ernie and Elise were joined by Gygax's friends Don Kay, Rob Kuntz, and Terry Kuntz. About a month after his first session, Gygax created the nearby city of Greyhawk, where the players' characters could sell their treasure and find a place to rest. Home campaign, 1972 to 1979. All right. As Gygax and Arneson worked to develop and publish the rules for Dungeons & Dragons through TSR, Gygax continued to design and present the dungeons and environs of Castle Greyhawk to his circle of friends and family, using them as playtesters for new rules and concepts. As the players began to explore more of the world outside of the castle and city, Gygax developed other regions and cities for them, with play sessions occurring 7 or more times a week. Gygax didn't have the time or inclination to create the map for a whole new world. He simply drew his world over a map of North America, adding new cities and regions as his world slowly grew through ongoing adventures. The city and castle of Greyhawk were placed near the real world position of Chicago, his birthplace. Various other places were clustered around it. For instance, the rival city of Divers he placed in the area of real-world Milwaukee. Gygax also continued to develop the dungeons underneath the castle. By the time he was finished, the complex labyrinth encompassed 13 levels filled with devious traps, secret passageways, hungry monsters, and glittering treasure. Although details of these original Greyhawk dungeons have never been published in detail, Gygax gave some glimpses of them in an article he wrote for the European fanzine Europa in 1975. Before the rules for D&D were published, Old Greyhawk Castle was 13 levels deep. The first level was a simple maze of rooms and corridors, for none of the participants had ever played such a game before. The second level had 2 unusual items, a Nixie pool and a fountain of snakes. The third featured a torture chamber and small cells and prison rooms. The fourth was a level of crypts and undead. The fifth was centered around a strange font of black fire and gargoyles. The sixth was a repeating maze with dozens of wild hogs in inconvenient spots, naturally backed up by appropriate numbers of wereboars. The seventh was centered around a circular labyrinth and a street of masses of ogres. The 8th through 10th levels were caves and caverns featuring trolls, giant insects, and a transporter nexus with an evil wizard with a number of tough associates guarding it. The 11th level was the home of the most powerful wizard in the castle. He had Balrogs as servants. The remainder of the level was populated by Martian white apes, except the subpassage system underneath the corridors, which was full of poisonous critters with no treasure. Level 12 was filled with dragons. The bottom level, number 13, contained an inescapable slide which took the players clear through to China, from whence they had to return via outdoor adventure. It was quite possible to journey downward by an insidious series of slanting passages, which began on the second level, but the likelihood of following such a route unknowingly didn't become too great until the 7th or 8th level. Side levels included a barracks with orcs, hobgoblins, and gnolls continually warring with each other, a museum, a huge arena, an underground lake, a giant's home, and a garden of fungi. Anyone who made it to the bottom level alive met Zagig, the insane architect of the dungeons. Zagig is a reverse homophone of Gygax, and it was Gygax's inside joke that the person who had designed the dungeon himself must be insane. Only 3 players ever made it to the bottom level and met Zagig, all of them during solo adventures. Rob Kuntz playing Robilar, Gygax's son Ernie playing Tensor, and Rob's brother Terry playing Tarek. Their reward was to be instantly transported to the far side of the world, where they each faced a long solo trek back to the city of Greyhawk. Tarek and Tensor managed to catch up to Robilar along the way, and the 3 journeyed back to Greyhawk together. By this time, a dozen players crowded Gygax's basement every night, with over 20 at times on weekends, and the effort needed to plan their adventures took up much of Gygax's spare time. He had been very impressed with Rob Kuntz's imaginative play as a player and appointed Rob to be co-dungeon master of Greyhawk. This freed up Gygax to work on other projects and also gave him an opportunity to participate as a player, creating characters like Urag and Mordenkainen. In order to make room for Rob Kuntz's dungeons, Gygax scrapped his bottom level and integrated Rob's work into the Greyhawk dungeons. Gygax and Kuntz continued to develop new levels for their players, and by the time the Greyhawk home campaign drew to a close in 1985, the castle dungeons encompassed more than 50 levels. Significant player characters of the home campaign. While many players participating in the Gygax and Kuntz home campaign were occasional players, sometimes not even naming their characters, others played far more frequently, and several of their characters became well known to the general gaming world before publication of the Greyhawk campaign setting. Some of these characters became known when Gygax mentioned them in his various columns, interviews, and publications. In other cases, when Gygax created a new magical spell for the game, he would sometimes use the name of a wizard character from his home campaign to add verisimilitude. I don't even know how to say that word. Verisimilitude to the spell names, such as Melf's Acid Arrow, Melf being a character created by his son Luke. Some of the characters who became synonymous with Greyhawk at that time included Merlind, Robilar, I'm not going to read this, I'm about done, Tensor, Tarek, Iraq's cousin, Bigby, Melf, Rary, Otto, Dromage, the Circle of 8. Some of these names I recognize from the Dungeon Master's Guide. Well, that's about 20 minutes. It's a long article, so if you want to read the rest, go for it. I don't get paid enough to read the whole thing, but at least that's a sample.